This week, there are only two stories in our world right now, Gaza and The Voice. And we dedicate the next hour to better understanding both. We'll bring you some of the best commentary to help make sense of what's going on in Israel right now. David Adler from the Australian Jewish Association will join me as we discuss the fallout here in Australia. And then a very special interview on The Voice to Parliament with the University of Queensland Constitutional Law Professor James Allan joining me in the studio.
The polls are now showing 40+% of Labor voters voting no. So if he starts insulting the intelligence of no voters after this referendum, if we get the result where the polls are showing, he'll be insulting his own voters. I mean, I actually thought when I said this would lose that Dutton could win the next election. I think I said that too, because Albanese has expended a lot of political capital on this. And if it goes down in a bad way, he's not only sort of revivified the right of center vote, there's going to be a lot of people on the left who aren't happy with him.
G'day and welcome to episode 227 of The Other Side Australia for the weekend commencing Friday, October 13, 2023. I'm Damien Curry, and what a heavy and sad week it has been. But before we get to the very serious and difficult stories of this week, I do want to just point to some good news. Let's celebrate the fact that Lei Cheng has been released from China by the Chinese authorities. She is now the Australian journalist. She's now back in Melbourne with her family. So that's one piece of good news that we can happily celebrate. We won't be able to cover the story today because we do have so much else to get, so much other stuff to get through. And the other thing that I'm really quite moved and excited by is the fact that it seems Australians have not been sucked in by identity politics this time. It seems Australia is going to vote the Voice proposition down, and that the vast majority of Australians are going to be voting no in this referendum. And that is a wonderful thing, because it means that we haven't been fooled, we haven't been bullied, we haven't been cajoled by identity politics into believing that this is about helping Aboriginal people. It isn't about helping Aboriginal people. It's about creating another bureaucracy and of course, just more money, more layers of bureaucracy, more public servants to do the same of what they've been doing, which hasn't been terribly effective to date. Now, even though we are running at 2-1, people voting no to yes, according to the polls, remember, it is very, very possible that there could be a late surge to yes. It's very, very important that everybody who wants to vote no gets out. It is compulsory to vote, but do get out to vote. Do talk to your friends, do remind them that this isn't about helping Aboriginal people. It's about creating another bureaucracy which will hinder getting the right sort of help to Aboriginal people. But the most exciting poll of all was in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it showed that no, 80% of Aboriginal people in Australia don't support The Voice, 60% only. 60% of Aboriginal Australians support The Voice. But think about that for a moment, how incredible our Aboriginal and Indigenous people are in this country, that they would vote. You know, they have the opportunity to vote for something that would be in their self-interest, in a sense, and they're going to vote against it because they know fundamentally to their bones that it is the wrong thing to divide your country by race or to put race into the Constitution. And they just want to be Australians, everyday Australians like the rest of us. It's the politics of low expectations, the racism of low expectations. And our Aboriginal and Indigenous Australians see straight through it. And they know what they're supporting, or at least 40% of them do, which is quite an extraordinary number. If this Voice proposal can't get more than 90% support among Indigenous Australians, then it has no right even being, the question even being put to a referendum. So I do hope this thing goes down. We've still got to do a little bit of work on it, so let's not get complacent. But here we are, it's looking pretty good. So there's some things to be happy about before we get into the really sad stuff of the week. We were going to be talking about The Voice for most of this show, but then of course the world shifted seismically last weekend. And I know Aussies are generally in the habit of not paying much attention to Middle East politics. I mean, why should we? But what happened this week was not the usual. It's important to us because it could set off a multinational conflict. Really could, quite easily. And because of the AUKUS treaty and other treaties that Australia's involved in, of course, that could take Australia into war. While Palestinians and Jews have fought over the territory of Israel for centuries, we haven't seen a terrorist organisation win government, as Hamas did in Gaza in 2006. We haven't seen the complete blockading of a region, as Israel did to Gaza after Hamas won. And we haven't never seen an attack on Israel by air, sea and ground forces like what we saw last weekend in our lifetimes. This was no ordinary military attack by militants. It was a large-scale, coordinated, well-organised and executed terror attack by terrorists, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on all the people of Israel, designed for maximum horror and shock, and perhaps designed to provoke Israel into a massive counter-offensive. But why? Surely Hamas knew the consequences of this would be horrible for Gaza. That's what we'll try to go a little way towards understanding on the other side today. No doubt, like me, if you spend a lot of time on social media, you've seen more graphic images than you care to in a lifetime this week. I've decided not to share a lot of it here, but I do think that most people should go watch what they feel that they can tolerate, because the head in the sand option won't give you a fully informed picture. The horrors inflicted by the Hamas fighters were utterly unspeakable acts of terror and barbarism, way beyond any Geneva Conventions for War, the international legal standards for humanitarian treatment in war that were negotiated after World War II. So, as always on this show, we like to go back to the beginning. Let's start with the basics of what happened. For the background, let's look at a left-leaning news organisation so we don't get accused of any bias. This is the UK's Channel 4. Their foreign affairs correspondent, Secunda Kamani, had been to the Kfar Aza kibbutz. That's one of the kibbutzes that was targeted by the militants last Saturday. This was some of his report back to Channel 4 News in London.
The Israeli military have continued to block off access to some of the sites of the worst atrocities committed by Hamas militants. We were, however, able to gain access to one kibbutz, one small community that came under attack, and walking around, it was clear that the residents stood no chance against the gunmen. The latest report suggests that a total of around 1,500 Hamas militants infiltrated from the Gaza Strip into Israel, and some reports suggest that some of the victims may have been decapitated, beheaded, but really such a horrific level of violence was used. The bodies of so many of the victims are in such a bad condition that it's hard to know if it's true or not. What is clear is that men, women and children were ruthlessly and mercilessly killed. A warning that some of the images in our report are distressing. The inhabitants of Kfar Aza have either fled, been taken hostage or murdered. Festive decorations put up shortly before the attack still hang from homes. Walking through here, seeing what's left of people's homes, people's lives, you get a sense of just how terrifying it must have been for the residents when the gunmen launched their assault. The focus now, the awful task of retrieving and identifying bodies. This salvage team has just arrived here from the site of the massacre at a music festival.
Some of them try to hide, and we see them in a position like defending position. And this is pretty much, you asked me about what I saw, the smell there, the thinking about what they had in their few seconds of life. And last one, about the freight, about the horror that they went through.
That's the UK's Channel 4, their foreign affairs correspondent Secunda Kamani reporting from the Kfar Aza kibbutz earlier in the week. What has shocked the world about these attacks is the brutality. This was not war. This was mass-scale organised terrorism of the most grotesque and inhumane kind. Not just barbarism, but medieval barbarism.
Teachers Shlomi and Shah are just two of the hundreds upon hundreds of victims murdered in their homes. They believed in peace between the communities and sent their daughter Shir to a school with Jewish, Muslim and Christian children.
But Hamas doesn't want peace. Hamas controls the Gaza Strip on Israel's southwest coast. They're recognised by Australia as a terrorist organisation. They won the election in Gaza in 2006 after ousting the other major Palestinian leadership group, the PLO, and its sister organisation, Fatah. The other territory that Israel permitted self-government, known as the West Bank, in the country's east bordering Jordan is run by Fatah, the Palestinian leadership group that Hamas believes is too compromising and too moderate. But Hamas is basically a proxy for Iran, and this whole thing has a lot to do with wider Middle East geopolitics. Regardless of where you sit on all that stuff, the horror and inhumanity of this latest atrocity alone cannot be excused or tolerated under any circumstances. Channel 4's Secunda Kamani spoke to one woman who survived the incursion.
She spent hours terrified and alone in a safe room whilst the attack took place.
I couldn't turn on the lights. Will they hear me? Will they know I'm home?
As we talk, warning sirens blare.
As long as you're in Israel, you're a threat.
We're in a hospital where Shear's teenage brother is undergoing surgery. He was with her parents when they died.
We talked to our brother and we asked him what happened. I told him, I need to know. He said that as soon as the red alerts started, they ran into the safe room and they heard at some point glass breaking, and then they heard people walking in their house, and they heard them outside of the safe room speaking in Arabic. And my dad said they put a mattress in front of the door, and my mom told my brother to hide between the bed and the wall. And then there was a big explosion, and my brother said he heard my dad saying that he lost his arm. And they started shooting everywhere, and my mom died on him. She died protecting him, and she told him everything will be all right. And he was alone for so many hours, and he was wounded, and nobody could help him.
Israel cannot not respond. The anger and fury in Israel right now is virtually unanimous. This is an Arab-Israeli TV news presenter, Lucy Aharish, an Arab Israeli, speaking to her TV audience in Israel this week.
I'm sorry that I'm using my microphone to send a message to the world. As a journalist, this is my only weapon. Since Saturday morning, the state of Israel is under attack. Our beloved country is under attack. We are under an attack of a brutal, barbaric, inhumane terror organization. Not an entity, not a government, not a leadership, but a terror organization. Hamas murdered and slaughtered in cold blood innocent babies, children, elderly, women, and men, in their homes, in their beds. Hamas kidnapped and took captive innocent babies, children, elderly, women, and men. And we, the citizens of the state of Israel, all of us, left and right, secular and religious, Jews, Christians, Druze, Muslims, minorities, and immigrants from all over the world, stand united together in this fight. We're fighting for our lives, for our future, and mostly for the future of our children. Don't be mistaken. We experience difficulties, disagreements, and major disputes, like any other country on this globe. But it does not mean that we will not protect ourselves and our children, our homeland.
That's Lucy Aharish, an Arab-Israeli TV news presenter there. She also had some harsh words for those who've not been supporting Israel this week.
And for everyone out there who's not condemning this inhumane massacre, try to imagine for a second that you're waking up on Saturday morning with your children sleeping next to you, waking up to the sounds of sirens, and then in a split of a second, a terrorist comes into your home your safe shelter and starts murdering your family in front of your eyes. Can you imagine that? Look into the victim's eyes. Look into our eyes, in the eyes of all the citizens of this land, and stand with us on the right side of history. בכמה מילים בעברית. ביום שאחרי אנחנו לא נקום לאותה ישראל. אנחנו לא נקום אותם אנשים. ואנחנו נקום חזקים יותר, וטובים יותר, ובתקווה גם מאוחדים יותר.
So you get the intensity of feeling in Israel. If that's how an Arab Israeli citizen feels, if that's how secular Israelis feel, imagine how an Israeli Jew is feeling. The country is more united, more strongly than ever before. So is this the final straw? Is there no way to make a compromise or deal with Hamas or the Palestinians of Gaza? Even Egypt fears Hamas. They have a border with Gaza too, which they blockaded in 2014. So the 2.3 million Gazan people have nowhere to turn. Now some say, tough luck, you voted for Hamas, you voted for terrorists to rule you, and they've mounted an attack, and they've mounted attack after attack on Israel by rockets, and now this latest horror. But here's the quandary for Israel and its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. If he goes in hard, thousands of innocent children are going to die. Thousands more civilians who want nothing to do with this war or with Hamas will die. And that will give Hamas, and more importantly its backers, Iran, exactly what they might be seeking: regional and global condemnation of Israel. In their diabolical worldview, they know the West has no stomach for the slaughter of innocents. They will use our kindness and goodwill against us. The retaliation from Israel has already begun in the air, and it may have begun on the ground by the time you watch this show. And the consequences are already as expected. Here's the UK Channel 4's news again. While they couldn't get inside Gaza, a filmmaker inside the region was able to get this footage out to them. This is by a filmmaker by the name of Yusuf Hamad, who lives in the Gaza Strip. The footage was obtained and aired in the UK by Britain's Channel 4.
This little boy was pulled out alive, his face blackened. His rescuer rushes to his mother. But before she can embrace her boy, she passes out in a shock. Gaza is under a complete siege. No water, no food, no electricity, and no escape. It's too hard. Some almost give up. But you can't stand still for long.
Please, my family, they're just kids.
That's the work of filmmaker Yusuf Hamad, who lives in the Gaza Strip, obtained and aired in the UK by Britain's Channel 4. Be careful who you vote for. If you think it doesn't matter, it really, really does. Always the children, always the innocents who suffer the most in war. Now let me be very clear, there is no moral equivalency between the position of Israel and the position of Hamas in all of this. Israel's a sovereign state. And while you may argue the history, it has, in modern times, essentially supported peaceful coexistence. Hamas, on the other hand, has, as part of its charter, the elimination of Israel as one of its objectives. The suffering of the children in Gaza lays at the feet of Hamas, not Israel. So no matter what you think about the long-term political situation in Israel and Palestine, this particular attack cannot be supported in any way, shape or form, as we mentioned earlier. Hamas is not the only Arab government in Israel. On the east side of the country, the other side, the area known as the West Bank, is controlled by Fatah. It used to look after Gaza too, but they were considered too moderate by Hamas, too open to compromise with Israel. The people of Gaza voted for Hamas in 2006, so now Hamas controls Gaza and Fatah controls the West Bank. One thing that's angered conservative Jews in the United States and around the world is the way the media has reported on the story, calling Hamas militants rather than terrorists. Headlines in UK and US newspapers being careful not to offend anyone with their coverage by taking sides. Again, moral equivalency is the problem. Nobody seems to have nailed that issue in the news commentary of the past week, better than US Daily Wire commentator Ben Shapiro, himself a conservative Jew. Shapiro points to the left's bizarre belief in moral equivalency, the idea that all people and all ideologies and all religions are somehow equal, that no nation or society's values are better than anyone else's. Ben told Megyn Kelly's US show this week that this is a huge problem for all of us in the West.
Obviously, the great moral sickness of the West is its intention to continue moral equivalency between one group of people who wish to defend children and one group of people who wish to murder them as often as humanly possible. I've seen pictures that have not been made public of families burned and babies beheaded and all the rest of this sort of stuff. And this is what Hamas intended to do. This is what they always intended to do. This has been in their charter since 1987. There are no surprises here. The only surprise is that it took this long for Hamas to be successful. But this has been their intention all along. The Palestinian Authority, the Palestine Liberation Organization, pays actual bounties to terrorist families. Islamic Jihad is a terrorist group. And yet the West has spent the last 30, 40 years pretending that there was some sort of deal that could be cut here. I think that the Israeli government was under the impression since 2006, when they completely pulled out of the Gaza Strip. In 2005, they pulled literally thousands of Jews out of their homes in the northern tip of the Gaza Strip and turned over the entire area to the Palestinians, who promptly burned every Jewish home and greenhouse, and then voted for Hamas. They voted Hamas into power. Hamas has been the governing power in the Gaza Strip since 2006, so for 17 years. And they've been launching rocket attacks ever since into Israel. Israel believed that because of the security barrier, the touch fence, and because of Iron Dome, which shoots down the rockets that are fired routinely from Gaza, that they could live with some semblance of at least quasi-normalcy, although it's hard to describe normalcy, as you have to run to a bunker every few months for a week or so while rockets rain down on your home, but it was at least livable. Well, what's happened over the course of the last few days is not only catastrophic, but it demonstrates, number one, why there needs to be a state of Israel, why the state of Israel exists, why the notion of a Jewish state to defend Jews exists. It really exposes the moral vacuity of many people in the West for precisely what it is. And it shows more than anything else what evil actually looks like.
That's the Daily Wire's Ben Shapiro speaking to Megyn Kelly on her US radio and online show. The hideous display of racism we saw at the Opera House this week was un-Australian in the extreme, and it happened right in front of the national symbol, the image that every overseas tourist has of Australia, the Sydney Opera House. And it's gone all around the world on TV.
This was the Free Palestine crowd in New York City. Take a look there. Celebrating. I think that's the one where the guy has a Nazi insignia. Celebrating this weekend's terror attack, smiling, chanting. Yep, holding up a picture of a swastika. Similar celebrations taking place in London, in England, and in Sydney, in Australia, where Free Palestine demonstrators there were chanting, quote, "Gas the Jews." Don't believe me? Take a look. Where's the Jews? 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 Gas the Jews, and Jewish people in Australia have been told to stay home. Wow. Back in Chicago, the group Black Lives Matter, they're standing in solidarity with Hamas, posting this image, apparently glorifying the terrorist paragliders, the ones that raped, murdered, abducted hundreds of young, unarmed civilians at that concert dedicated to peace. That's where 260 innocent people plus were killed. Meanwhile, student leaders on college campuses around this country are planning a day of resistance to support the terrorist group Hamas. dozens of student groups at Harvard, 31 groups directly blaming Israel alone for what happened, all coming together in support of Hamas. Is this what they're learning at Harvard University? Bigotry, anti-Semitism, outright hate? Really? In this politically correct world, this woke world, this cancel culture world, that's okay with Harvard?
Harvard University has a serious problem with leftist infiltration, and it's just going down the drain. That's the Sean Hannity Show on the Fox News network. 4 million viewers on cable TV in the US alone, then millions more online and abroad seeing that footage from the Opera House. Joining me now is Dr. David Adler from the Australian Jewish Association. Dr. Adler, thanks for your time. I know it's an incredibly busy week. What was your reaction to that protest on Monday night?
Damien, we were absolutely shocked. And as you know, we had people who turned up at the Sydney Opera House. They lit flares. They burnt the Israeli flag. Worst of all were their chants. And their chants were F the Jews and gas the Jews. Now, it needs to be pointed out quite clearly, this is not a political comment. They weren't saying we hate Israel. They were saying F the Jews. They weren't saying we hate Israelis. They were saying gas the Jews, which of course is a reference to the mass murder in the Holocaust. This is raw anti-Semitism. Subsequently, we have had numerous threats through the Jewish community in Melbourne and Sydney, some of them quite serious. We had a mob in Melbourne in a car who said they were hunting Jews. They were caught by the police and arrested. We've had death threats in Sydney, and I personally have had to consult security advice. The Jewish community broadly has had to increase security precautions.
Yeah.
This is a very, very sad commentary on Australia.
Yeah. David, what's been the police response a few days on? Are you satisfied that the New South Wales Police and the federal police are actually well across the threat here?
One of the most dreadful things about what happened is, of course, this Hamas supporting protest was organised when the New South Wales government was going to light up the Opera House in blue and white as a tribute to the Israelis that were murdered by the terrorist acts. Jewish people want to go there and pay their respects, but the police told us to stay away from the town hall area and to stay away from the Opera House area. So rather than offer protection to the Jewish community, they basically handed over the city of Sydney to the Hamas terrorist supporting mob. Subsequently, there has been a little bit of positive action by the New South Wales Police, but not much. I've been told by a number of experts that what we saw at the Opera House is a clear breach of the Crimes Act, incitement to violence, and we would be surprised if there are any arrests and prosecutions coming out of it. I hope there is, but clearly the law is not being enforced in New South Wales when it comes to protecting the Jewish community from potential violent protests by those Islamic Jihad supporters.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's not much point in having laws if we don't enforce them. David, I know you're extremely busy right now, but before you go, I do want to get your thoughts on the Hamas terrorist assault generally. The big question is, what on earth were they thinking? Surely Hamas realises that an attack of this magnitude with this level of absolute barbarism would potentially result in their complete annihilation. Why would they do this? And why do you think why would they do it at this time?
Well, Damien, firstly, we need to understand that we need to view this not from a Western perspective, but from a Middle Eastern Islamic perspective. They have said in chants, we value death as you value life. The highest honour is to be a martyr, a shahid, in fighting the Jews.
Right.
So they've been brainwashed for 2 generations to hate Israel, to hate the Jews, and the best thing they can do is sacrifice their blood in the service of Palestine.
But what's the wider geopolitical game here? This was nearly a suicide mission for Hamas. I know that there have been some theories, but just interested to hear your perspective. Why actually now?
Well, it's hard to know exactly, but clearly one of the powerful speculations is that Israel and Saudi Arabia have been in detailed, prolonged discussions about a possible peace treaty, normalisation. It would be a huge alliance, and it would be one which would run counter to the interests of Iran. Iran is the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the area. The Saudis feel threatened by it. One of the reasons that they've been trying to work out arrangements with Israel. It would make it much more difficult for the Saudis to proceed with a peace agreement with Israel if there are hundreds and possibly thousands of their brethren being killed as a result in Gaza and maybe even elsewhere. So one of the possible speculations is that this is Iran sabotaging an extension of the Abraham Accords, an extension of the peace process. It makes sense. Whether it's correct or not, I guess we'll see in time. I'm hoping that the Saudis are determined and mature enough not to be swayed by the action that Israel has to take now in self-defense. Hamas has to be crushed. It's like ISIS. It's like the way the Allies dealt with the Nazis in the latter part of World War II, even the way that US dealt with Imperial Japan after Pearl Harbor. Peace comes when the opponent fully surrenders to your terms. Hamas will probably have to be annihilated for that to occur.
Yeah, it's terrifying stuff. Thanks for your time once again, Dr. David Adler there from the Australian Jewish Association. So, if you protest against the demolition of human rights in Australia, if you protest against our state or federal government, this will be the response. But if you protest in favour of and in celebration of terrorists and terrorism of the most barbaric kind, then this will be the response.
The police minister admits a formal application to protest was never lodged, but officers say they did what they had to do.
It was considered the best option for police was to manage the movement of those people from Sydney Town Hall to the Opera House.
The Premier's defended his decision.
We lit up the Opera House specifically to show solidarity with the Jewish community.
Now, I sympathise with the police having to manage these situations and do crowd control, and it is actually better sometimes to let people have their say and just keep the peace. It's the political hypocrisy that I think's got to be called out. Australian politicians use the police to protect themselves from protests critical of their own misrule, but chanting support for a terrorist organisation on our streets and chanting racist slogans, both illegal activities in this nanny state country, by the way, and where are the police and the Human Rights Commission Karens now? It's wishy-washy, pathetic leadership, a failure to stand up for Australia's core values, and that is dangerous long term, very dangerous. And speaking of pathetic leaders, good God, what a disgrace the Labor Party's response has been. Why? Because the left wing of the Labor Party in Australia supports Palestine, and Albo is firmly of the left wing. Also, Albo's electorate of Grayndler in Sydney's inner west, the wokest hellhole of this country, has a large Muslim population. For an insight into what real leadership looks like in a situation like this, here's the UK's Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, addressing a Jewish memorial service in London this week.
I wanted to come here tonight to stand with you in solidarity in Israel's hour of need. As the Prime Minister of this country, I am unequivocal. The people who support Hamas are fully responsible for this appalling attack. They are not militants. They are not freedom fighters. They are terrorists.
That is leadership. It's called standing up for the principles and values that built your nation. It's different to politics, which is sucking up to as many interest groups as you can.
Their barbaric acts are acts of evil. There is no other word to describe what we have seen. Teenagers at a festival of peace, gunned down in cold blood. Innocent men, women, and children abducted, raped, slaughtered. Even a Holocaust survivor taken away as a captive. And much of this sickening evidence posted online. There are not two sides to these events. There is no question of balance. I stand with Israel.
And I stand with Rishi Sunak on this, the Prime Minister of the UK putting his political interests second. There are far more voters in the UK that won't like those comments than in Australia. That took courage. Meanwhile, back in Australia, the country where inner city trendies like to vote for communists pretending to be Greens because they don't study who they're actually voting for more than 2 seconds. And well, you know, the Greens, they seem nice. I mean, if you voted Green, here's what you voted for. This is the Greens Senator Mehreen Faruqi. She tweeted this week in response to the news from the New South Wales government that it was going to light up the Opera House blue and white in solidarity with Israel. She posts this, and I quote, "One colonial government supporting another. What a disgrace. Hashtag Free Palestine." Let that sink in. This is the level of intellect we're dealing with here, folks. Like a first-year uni student brainwashed by their first Marxism class who hasn't yet grown out of it. Some of them never do. But what an incredibly simplistic, naive, stupid, and childish worldview. These people are sick, and most of them lurk in the Australian Greens. I don't care if you're the most green of green environmentalists. Please don't ever vote Green. They are a communist party, dressed up as a Green party, and they already have way too much power in this country. Inner city Brisbane, are you listening? 3 federal electorates, all Green. And that's only, it would be the same in Sydney and Melbourne if it wasn't for the emergence of the teals, the pseudo-Greens. But it gets better. Mehreen then offers her high school level geopolitical analysis for us. Oh, wonderful. Or maybe I should say primary school level. My thoughts are with those living the brutal savagery of war in the Middle East at this moment. Civilians should never be the target. Wow, talk about taking a stand. How brave. First, state the obvious. Yes, Mehreen, all of our thoughts are with those living with the brutal savagery of war. And civilians should never be the target. But what exactly would you do about it if you were Prime Minister of this country or of Israel? Oh no, you couldn't answer that question. That'd be too hard, wouldn't it? And then it gets even better as she displays her mighty wisdom and analysis of the situation. Gaza's civilians are on the precipice of annihilation because the blockade means they have nowhere to go. Oh, more stating of the obvious there. Yes, there's a blockade, not just on the Israeli side of the border, of Gaza's border, but on the Egyptian side too, Mehreen, because Egypt is scared of Hamas too. And the genius continues. If we are serious about ending violence and moving to peace, there has to be an end to the blockade, an end to Israel's occupation and oppression, and freedom for Palestine. Oh, I see. It's all Israel's fault. It's the blockade. But why does the blockade exist, Mehreen? Oh, it's because the people of Gaza elected a terrorist organisation to lead them. And they keep firing rockets into Israel. And the Israelis can't trust them long enough to let the blockade down for 1 second. As Hamas has just proven, big time. I'm assuming you're not a big chess player, right, Maureen? Folks, there's nothing wrong with not understanding Middle East politics very well if you're me or you. But if you're an Australian senator, and if you want to weigh into these things the day after they happen in such callous, disconnected, insensitive, obnoxious, and opinionated way as she's just done, then you've got to educate yourself. But I suspect Senator Maureen Faruqi knows exactly what she's doing and why. Like almost all of the Greens, she is an absolute misfit, radical, and a disgrace to our parliament. So again, I simply say this: no matter your politics, never vote Green. If you're an environmentalist, support the more environmental MPs from other parties. If you're a lefty, support Labor. Never, ever, ever vote Green. It only encourages them and gives them the false impression that they are worthy of holding positions of office in our great nation. They are not. You know, people sometimes ask me, why are you so against the left? They're kind and compassionate people. They just want what's best for everyone. The moral equivalency shown by our enlightened left-wing thinkers in Australia, you know, because they're so much more kind and compassionate than the rest of us, we right-wing nutjob cookers, it's childish in the extreme at times and a major cop-out. Faced with the moral quandary that Benjamin Netanyahu and all Israeli citizens are faced with right now, how to respond to this horrific attack on them, the worst barbarism and inhumanity you could imagine when you know that killing children is going to be the result. That moral quandary is utterly mind-blowing, mind-blowingly difficult. So these intellectually superior leftists, they're not smart, they're not kind, they're not intelligent. They're cowards who want to cop out of having to face the horrific reality of planet Earth's toughest moral dilemmas and retreat into a safe space. Fine, if you want to not face up to the moral dilemma. But you don't get to then sit back and have an opinion and make commentary from the sidelines. One day saying, oh, that's terrible what Hamas has done there. And the next day saying, oh, that evil Netanyahu. You have to draw a line sometimes. You have to pick a side sometimes. And this is one such time. This week we saw a very good example of how well-meaning policies of the left can be destructive to a society. How supporting and voting for the nice-sounding option in the moment and not being responsible enough to consider the long-term complications, unintended consequences and effects of something is very, very dangerous. Multiculturalism was a nice-sounding left-wing policy when it was adopted in Australia in the 1970s. I'm mixed race. My great-grandparents were immigrants. Millions of migrants have made Australia their home and helped to build and grow this nation. But they came to Australia respecting dominant Australian values, respecting that Australia had its own existing dominant culture. It was a nation built upon British systems and Irish cultural influence rooted in a Judeo-Christian ethic. That's why they came here. That doesn't mean we close our doors to immigrants and the richness that immigration has brought to Australia. But multiculturalism has to be tempered by an acceptance of and deep respect for the core values of the host nation. And those core values have to be defined, promoted, and taught. If not, the nation will fall apart. Was that too preachy? We had someone write in and say they like the show, but it's too preachy. It's an opinion show. It's supposed to make you stop and think. We also get some people writing in saying I'm too wishy-washy. I should go harder on the left than I do. So, you know, go figure. But I think most of you get that you're supposed to disagree with me some of the time and keep watching the show. What we try to do here is get back to the facts and the background of the stories and show you the best opinion stuff we can possibly find. Sometimes we'll take a view, sometimes we won't. But you draw your own conclusions. That's the most important thing. We're trying to do something different here and we hope you like it, but we do need your support. Please tell your friends about the show. Please like and share our episodes on the ADH platform and all of our clips that we put out on social media, even if you've already seen them. New episodes of The Other Side Australia stream every Friday night at 8 p.m. here on ADH TV. and then they're up on demand for you to watch thereafter anytime you like. And we really do need you to support ADH TV. So please hop on over to adh.tv. That's it, adh.tv. No .com, not anything else, just adh.tv if you're not watching the show over there now. It's totally free. This helps reduce our dependence on big tech, and it keeps us free and independent. And please watch and support all our other shows too. Alan Jones, Fred Paul, Mark Stein, Alexandra Marshall, Spectator TV, fantastic stuff. Nick Cater, great. Dave Pello, wonderful. Daisy Cousins, terrific. And Professor David Flint, who we sincerely admire and whose content we enjoy. And we'll see some of it in a moment. And it doesn't matter when you want to watch. You can watch any show, anytime, and all the back catalogue too for free. adh.tv, please join us. Well, there's something a little lighter, and who would have thought this would be a little lighter, but we're going to move on to the voice to Parliament now. And although it is unlikely, the no vote could, of course, still lose this thing. It is Friday night that we're streaming this show. We don't know yet the result, even though you may be watching after the result is known. But from where we sit, and if you are listening on Saturday or Friday night, the no vote could still lose. We can't get complacent. We've got to get out to vote. Remember, voting is compulsory. So do get out there and do talk to your friends about why it is not a good idea to vote yes. We're going to explore that right now in a little bit more depth with our special guest this week, Professor James Allan from the University of Queensland Law School. Yep. Great to have you.
Nice to be back, actually.
Good to have you back. And
Yep.
I might point out that you were one of the first people 6 months ago on this show who predicted that this probably wasn't going to go the way that the government had hoped. And even though we don't know the result now, the polls are certainly indicating that it's not going to go the right way for the government.
It would have to be every pollster in Australia being off by 10 points. So it'd be a bad day for the pollsters. So let's keep our fingers crossed. But as you say, can't get complacent. Get out there, and let's get a big 6 in front of this. I want to see something in the 60s.
Yeah, it would be good to send a message in that sense.
Big message.
That we're not that stupid. And I think I've been quite heartened actually by where Australians have shifted.
Yeah, me too. After lockdown and the pusillanimous way that Australians sort of behaved, it's nice to see a bounce back.
Yeah. Well, if you're watching and listening after Saturday, as I said, you already know the result, but we will have some aftermath analysis on the show next weekend. If you're not subscribed to ADH TV, you may have missed this. Interviews in depth with not one, but 2 former Prime Ministers with our wonderful Professor David Flint at the Australians for a Constitutional Monarchy conference this week. John Howard told Professor Flint that he has 3 reasons for voting no.
One of them is that I'm very much against categorising citizens. One people, one nation, one destiny, one future. And that's what we should be. I always believed very much in what I called One Australia, that we were united by a common citizenship. We should strive to give people equality of opportunity. We shouldn't divide people according to race. And the first and most serious flaw in this proposition is that we're creating a body to which only a small section of the population can be elected by, in turn, a small section of the population. Now that undermines the principle of a single citizenship.
Mr. Howard says the second reason he'll be voting no is that he worries that whatever's added to the Constitution could be interpreted by a future High Court in a way that wasn't even contemplated. Something we'll be speaking to Professor Allan about in just a moment.
And the third thing that I object to most strongly is that the government has not explained what's involved, what it means. And the first duty of any government, be it Labor or Coalition, that is proposing an amendment of the Constitution, is to tell people openly and frankly what's involved in the amendment. And we're told variously or it's very simple, it's just a humble request, which it's not. And we're also told that we'll give you the detail after you vote for it. Well, that's an odd way of campaigning in my book. I've been involved in politics a few years, and I always took the view that if you ask the people to support something, you should tell them what you're asking them to support, and particularly when it comes to changing our Constitution.
Former Prime Minister John Howard and former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, meanwhile, told Professor Flint that changing the Constitution in this way is simply not a safe thing to do.
Look, we've had quite adventurous courts in recent times, and I naturally, as a, I suppose, legal and constitutional conservative, wish it were otherwise. This is why we should be so careful with changing our Constitution, because in the end, the Constitution is what the High Court says it is, and the High Court has been, I think, to put it at its kindest, very adventurous in recent times when it comes to constitutional interpretation. And that's why the only safe change is minimal change, which is absolutely crystal clear and which preferably has no further potential ramifications. Now, the new Chapter 9, as proposed in the upcoming referendum, has gargantuan potential ramifications, and that's why I think it's so problematic and must be opposed.
Professor Allan, this is the point that you made on this very show 6 months ago, that we just don't know where this is going to head as far as how the High Court might interpret this new chapter in the Constitution afterwards, right?
Well, that's true. We have a pretty good idea because in my native Canada, something similar to this happened in 1982. And effectively, all of the people pushing for the change assured us that nothing would happen with the judges. And for about 5 years, nothing did happen. And then the judges let rip. Oh. And we have an activist court, as Mr. Abbott said right there, and Mr. Howard. And if you think it's going to get better, you just have to look at our current law schools. We are turning out social justice activists. They're just making stuff up. If you go back to 2020 and look at the Love case, this is without this constitutional change. They were deciding based on things like otherness and spiritual connection to the land, and they just effectively rewrote our Constitution. If you put in a
So the Love case was the case involving the Aboriginal gentlemen who had not never ever lived in Australia.
Well, they lived here, but they weren't citizens.
Right.
So if they'd taken out citizenship. So it's bog standard if someone gets convicted for a moderately serious offence that after their sentence is over and they're not Australians, you send them back to the country in which they have citizenship.
Right. These guys had committed a crime. Yeah. They were going to be sent back to, I think, Papua New Guinea.
One was Papua New Guinea, one was New Zealand.
Okay.
And they both served their sentence.
Right.
And anybody who wasn't Aboriginal would have been gone. And they ran this spiritual connection to the land. It is just flat out making it up. And here's the really painful...
That's our High Court.
That's our High Court, 4-3. And in the majority were 3 coalition appointees. All 3 George Brandis appointees. This is a painful thing to say, but Labour is, from our point of view, Labour is making better appointments to the High Court than the Liberals did. It's just shocking. So you have to be worried even if the Liberals are in power. I know it's hard with today's legal cast. It's hard to find constitutional conservatives, but they don't even try. They don't even try.
On the yes side, we've got, they claim 70 constitutional lawyers signing a letter.
Yeah, I know that. Well,
what's that about?
Well, most of them aren't constitutional lawyers.
Right.
And, you know, if you'd said how many of those people voted for Tony Abbott, it would be 0.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay. So they've selected us.
When you have a university system where 85 to 90% of people who work in the sort of various parts of the university are left-wing supporters, so Labour if you're lucky, but also Green voters. And we know this from the US because their public donations are public information. Universities are overwhelmingly left. You know, in Britain and the US, it used to be about 6-4 for the left wing. Now it's 9-1. There are whole departments that have absolutely no conservatives at all. And in law, I think I work at the most conservative law school in Australia, that's UQ. And out of, we might have 15 to 18% who vote coalition, maybe. There wouldn't be another law school, and there'd be whole law schools where you're looking at a quiet tax lawyer who doesn't say anything. So in terms
of... So we're stuffed in 10 years, basically, is what you're saying.
You know, here's the painful truth. 9 years of coalition governments, they didn't do anything to fix the universities. It got worse every year. When they wanted to do free speech, they appointed a Labour-appointed High Court judge, retired. They go and talk to the university vice chancellors. Well, on free speech issues, the vice chancellors are the problem. And on issues like one-sidedness, the vice chancellors are... In 9 years, did they talk to any conservatives who work at universities? No. Did they support Peter Ridd in any practical way? No.
Did they do anything about the ABC from our perspective?
No,
from
they
the
appointed the two people who are causing the problems. They appointed the managing director and the chair. And, and they appointed the entire Australian Human Rights Commission, who didn't say a word during COVID. They couldn't find one single rights infringement to talk about.
All right, so that brings us to this new Chapter 9 in the Constitution. So if we could just have a look at the wording of the first part of the new Chapter 9 proposed for the Constitution. It's 129. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Okay, so that first line, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, that in and of itself is a big change.
Yeah, people say recognition's okay on its own. It would be less bad than this. But again, the problem with even putting something about recognition is that we do not know what future judges will do with that. I mean, if they can make up what they did in Love based on the current Constitution, even putting in something that looks as mild as that first phrase, that's a problem.
Right, and so that's not in the, I mean, John Howard even said we were okay with it in the preamble.
We probably are, because the preamble is not part of the actual Constitution.
Right, but this is quite different. Okay. So
although again, who knows what the judges will do, but that's probably okay, but who knows?
So from the very get-go there, we are saying there is a different group of people in Australia based on race. That's essentially what we're saying. So we're bringing race into the Constitution with that first line of recognition.
Yeah, it's all just a question of how far does the wording go to empower judges to, and you don't know what they might do with it. So again, it gets steadily worse.
Okay, let's look at the first, section 1. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Is that artfully vague? By that I mean, is that deliberately vague?
Well, I think it is. Yeah. And again, it's quite odd not to be given any sort of details. And the way Mr. Howard said, it's quite odd for us just to be saying, here's a blank check and you decide later.
Of course, they could have written a bill. They could have written a complete legislation saying this is what the voice is going to be and here it is and let's just...
Yes, as far as I know, this is the first attempt to amend a constitution in the Anglosphere where the government already has the power to do what you're seeking to change the constitution. So in other words, they could enact via legislation a voice body right now. They have the power under their heads of power in Section 51, and yet, the problem with that from their point of view is if the body turns out to be a complete disaster, a future government could get rid of it. And I don't know why that's a problem. Once you put it in the written constitution, it's there forever. So if it turns out to be a complete disaster, there's nothing you can do about it. Now you could make it a different sort of body. So again,
but you'll get a challenge to that, right? You might get a challenge.
Yes.
This gives it gravitas in the High Court.
The reason the people who wrote this want this in the Constitution is because it'll be future tools for the unelected judiciary to start rewriting the Constitution. And as Mr. Abbott says, effectively, the Constitution is whatever the judges say it is. They are supposed to be constrained by the intended meaning of the Constitution makers. But when you read a case like Love, or you go back and look at the implied freedom jurisprudence, the claim that this is an honest interpretation of the text and the intended meaning is just completely bonkers. It is not.
Well, this is why to ordinary Aussies like me who aren't lawyers, you just have this sense that something's not quite right here because there's a contradiction in what they're telling us. They're saying, oh, this is only going to be a small change, yet...
Well, there's tactics, and there's the underlying reality. If they came out and said, wow, this could be great, the judges could use this to give us all sorts of stuff we can't get through the democratic process, people aren't going to buy that. But if you say it's a modest change, it's just an invitation, Damien. It's an invitation, come on over for dinner this Friday night. That's not what it is.
No.
That is not what it is.
So talk about misinformation and disinformation, right? I mean, we're getting a lot of that. I think we need to point that out, that's just been how the Yes campaign have run this thing. And then, of course, they say, oh, but misinformation and disinformation is a product of the No campaign. And I'm sure that if we lose, if Yes loses, we're going to hear nothing but,
well, I think,
oh, it was the misinformation campaign.
Personally, I think Mr. Albanese is constrained from running that argument after the referendum because the polls are now showing 40+% of Labour voters voting no. So if he starts insulting the intelligence of no voters after this referendum, if we get the result where the polls are showing, he'll be insulting his own voters. I mean, I actually thought when I said this would lose that Dutton could win the next election. I think I said that too, because Albanese has expended a lot of political capital on this. And if it goes down in a bad way, he's not only sort of revivified the right of center vote, there's going to be a lot of people on the left who aren't happy with him.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if Dutton is strong after the vote and takes no responsibility, no one on the no side caused this. We didn't ask them to put this forward. It's a terrible idea, and we bear no responsibility for the fact that they rammed this down our throats. Again, this is a lot like the Brexit vote. Every single element of elite society, the corporate elite, the public broadcaster, the charities, the universities, it's just like Brexit. All of them are aligned on one side and the average voter on the other. You know, so they gave $100 million of shareholders' money to the yes side. This is the first referendum where the government didn't publicly fund both sides. The first contested one.
Yeah, it's unreal.
It's a disgrace.
Yeah, it's a disgrace.
You know, they've gamed the question. The AEC is acting very sort of on the edge, sort of. Really, I would fire everybody in the AEC if I got into power. I don't like the fact that check marks count, but crosses don't count.
And I don't like the fact that they went out and said you can vote twice.
Again. You know, it could have been a mistake, or it could have been a sly little nod to people. Again, this is just shockingly bad behavior. So every element of elite society is lined up on the yes side. You would not believe what it's like on university campuses. And yet, I think, it's going to lose. It's going to lose even more than the Brexit vote.
All right, let's have a look at the rest of Chapter 9, the new part of the Constitution, the new chapter in our Constitution that this voice will lead to. Section 2 of that Chapter 9, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It may make representations to the Parliament and the executive government of the Commonwealth. In other words, it may make special representations above and beyond what any other Australian can do, right?
Look, everybody on the no side owes a vote of thanks to Mr. Albanese for this. Every time he had a choice to make, he took the most radical, expansive choice. So it could have been just a voice to Parliament and not the executive. That would have been more circumscribed. That would have had a higher chance of getting through. When they say the executive, that's every single branch of government. It could be the RBA. Who knows what it will be? And so that's the first problem. The second choice he had to make, it could have been worded to say, may make representations solely related to Aboriginal matters. It doesn't say that. And I'm positive that a future court will interpret the words as applying to potentially every bill that comes before Parliament and every matter that the executive considers.
Well, because we're all Australians.
That's right. This is a sweeping change. So he could have come up with a much more circumscribed proposal. It's going to apply to all elements of the executive as well as the Parliament. It potentially, we almost certainly know, will apply to every kind of future potential change. Imagine, we can't get a mine built now. Imagine what it would be like in the future.
All right, well, let's have a look at Section 3 of Chapter 9 of the proposed new chapter. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. That seems fairly benign. That's just saying that the Parliament will make the decision about how this is going to be structured.
Benign in one sense, not benign in another. So it means we have no clue what's going to be designed.
Right.
After the election, a Parliament controlled by Labour and the Greens will design this. I know Mr. Albanese said it'll be bipartisan. No, I don't believe that. But let's say it is bipartisan. It does allow a future Parliament to change the setup, but that requires bravery. And it takes us back to the second problem from above, which is a political one, that even when the High Court turns us in from making representations into a constitutional right to be consulted, when the yes camp says it is true that Parliament could eventually stand up to this body, that's true, they could. But the political reality is this activist class that will take over the voice body, so it'll be a small fraction of the 3% of Australians who are Aboriginal, they will produce policies that overwhelmingly the Labour and left side of politics agrees with. So there's never going to be, it's an asymmetry. That's not going to be a problem when Labour's in power.
So we're basically electing a left voice to Parliament.
It's almost certain. We don't even know if there are going to be elections. And then on top of that, the problem is that when the coalition comes into power, they will run up against a voice body that doesn't agree with them on a lot of things. And in order for the coalition to do something, they're going to have bravery. They're going to have a backbone. So when they're asking you as a voter, you are aware of the political reality that your whole safety relies on having a strong, confident, brave Liberal Party with a backbone. I mean, the odds of that are zero. As Mr. Albanese says, it'll be a brave parliament that stands up to this body if it gets into power, if we create it. And there's no sign of any bravery coming from the right side of politics. You're much better off as a voter just not to let this happen. For moral reasons, unequal citizenship, for political reasons, because we know the Liberal Party will roll over on everything, and for constitutional reasons, because it is a license for future judicial activism. It's bad on every count. Really
Jim,
bad.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. And will you come back next week, have a chat with us about the result?
I will come back if I'm not too hungover. I'm going to be hungover if we win, and if by some fluke we lose, I'm going to be really hungover.
Okay. Great to talk to you, and it was great to talk to you back in April, and I urge everybody to check out episode 2 of the Other Side interviews, episode 2 of the Other Side interviews. You'll find our 1-hour interview with Professor James Allan, predicting all of this 6 months ago, so check that out. That's all we have time for this week. What a show, what a week. Let's pray for as much peace as possible in the coming days, but it's going to be a tough time ahead. We'll see you next Friday.